The grand hall of the Windermere Hotel had been transformed into something that seemed to exist outside of time. Gilded ceilings reflected candlelight from iron sconces. Towering white peony arrangements swayed gently on every table whenever the string quartet reached a swell of music. Everything in that room whispered one single truth to the 300 guests gathered inside it, and that truth was wealth. Elena Marsh moved through that crowd wearing a gown that had required 4 fittings before it finally fit right. She carried herself the same way she carried herself into courtrooms, back straight, chin steady, eyes scanning just a little faster than anyone expected a bride's eyes to move on her own wedding day. People smiled as she passed. After 11 months engaged to Marcus Whitfield, she understood exactly what those smiles meant. She had made it. The girl who grew up in a modest 2-bedroom home in Colby Creek had married into the Whitfield name, and now she stood beneath chandeliers worth more than her father's entire pension. Elena returned every smile, because that was what the moment demanded. But quietly, she filed each one away the same way she filed evidence, noting who offered warmth and who merely performed it, wondering which smiles would still exist a year from now. Marcus stood a few feet away, shaking hands the exact way his father had trained him to, gripping just a touch too firmly, holding on just a beat too long, the kind of handshake that always seemed to expect something in return. He laughed easily with senators, with old money, with men whose companies made headlines in the business section Elena read every morning before heading to court. When his eyes met hers across the room, his expression shifted into something that looked, on the surface, like love. But underneath that softness, something else stayed perfectly still, patient, like a predator that had learned to wait. Elena wasn't naive. She had spent 6 years as a litigator, forcing her way into rooms that didn't want her, winning cases against firms 3 times the size of her own. She had built her career on noticing what lived beneath the surface, the flicker in a witness's hands, the pause right before a lie. She had noticed things about Marcus too, small signals early in their relationship. The way he spoke about his family's company, Whitfield Industrial, using language that sounded impressive but meant nothing at all. The way his father, Harold Whitfield, studied every room like he was calculating its price. She had seen these things and chosen to trust him anyway, the way people trust a bridge simply because everyone else is already standing on it. The first crack didn't come as a shout. It arrived as a folded sheet of paper, slipped by accident into a stack of seating charts a nervous waiter handed her, believing it was simply the final table arrangement. Elena opened it only to check her mother's seat number, and instead her eyes landed on wire transfer codes, the names of 3 shell companies she had never heard of, and a signature stamped with the Whitfield Industrial seal. This was not a small error. It was a map. The room seemed to shrink down to the size of that single page. The music kept playing. Toasts kept rising into laughter that climbed toward the gilded ceiling. But something inside her had turned cold and precise. She recognized the pattern instantly, the same pattern she'd spent years dismantling in depositions, consulting fees paid to companies that filed no tax returns, invoices for work nobody could actually describe. And twice on the page, underlined faintly in pencil by someone else's hand, one name appeared: Corvain Chemical, the same company linked 6 months earlier to a warehouse fire that had killed 2 night shift workers, quietly ruled an accident. Marcus had told her, back when she first read about that fire, that Whitfield Industrial had no real connection to Corvain beyond a minor supply agreement. She had believed him, because for once in her carefully guarded life, she had wanted to believe someone without cross-examining every word first. Now that belief was curdling in her hands. She searched the room and found him near the terrace doors, deep in conversation with his father. Neither man looked like they belonged at a celebration. Harold's hand gripped his son's shoulder, his mouth barely moving as he spoke. When Marcus finally looked up and found Elena across the room, his eyes hardened into something she had never seen from him before. He knew. Whatever this paper was, he already knew about it, and he had been counting on the quiet confidence of a man who had never once answered for anything, that she would never find it. Elena folded the document with steady hands and tucked it into her small clutch. She didn't run. She didn't turn pale. She crossed that ballroom the same way she crossed a courtroom before delivering a closing argument. When her mother, Carol reached for her hand near the head table, eyes bright with pride and worry. Elena only squeezed her fingers once, briefly, and kept walking. Carol knew her daughter well enough to understand that this composure wasn't peace. It was the silence before a verdict. Marcus caught up with her before she reached the terrace. His public smile was already back in place for the watching guests, but his voice, low and clipped, was not. He asked what exactly she thought she was doing, as if simply walking toward him was already an act of war. Elena told him quietly that she needed to speak with him alone. It was a small request, almost gentle. Still, his jaw tightened, because in this marriage he had expected a wife who performed devotion on cue, not one who could interrupt his evening with a single sentence. They stepped into the corridor behind the terrace, where the music faded to a distant heartbeat and the smell of peonies turned suddenly thick, almost suffocating. Elena drew the paper from her clutch and held it where he could see it. Marcus's eyes dropped to it, then rose to her face, and for one unguarded second, the mask slipped completely. What she saw underneath wasn't surprise. It was fear dressed up as fury. He reached for the document, demanding it, palm open, his voice hard enough that a passing waiter flinched and hurried away. Elena didn't hand it over. She asked him calmly why Whitfield Industrial's money kept finding its way to Corvain Chemical. His breathing changed. He told her it was old business, internal matters, things she didn't need to understand tonight of all nights. And that phrase, didn't need to understand, struck something old and raw in her, some quiet history of being managed instead of heard. She told him she understood perfectly, and that was exactly why she was asking. The door opened before he could answer. Harold Whitfield stepped into the corridor, flanked by two men in pale suits who trailed him like shadows, and the temperature in the hallway seemed to drop instantly. He looked at Elena the way he looked at a line item that had come in over budget. He said, in a voice soft and almost kind, that big parties always caused confusion. Papers switched, stories twisted. But every word carried a blade wrapped in silk. Elena slid the document back into her clutch and said calmly that any confusion could be cleared up easily enough with an independent audit. The silence that followed seemed to pull the air out of the corridor. One of the men in pale suits looked away. Marcus stepped closer, something lighting up in his eyes that he had always insisted he didn't have in him. And in that silence, with the music thinning behind them and 300 guests just beyond the wall, Marcus Whitfield raised his hand, fast, almost unreal, as though it belonged to someone else entirely, and brought it across Elena Marsh's face in front of his own father, in front of the caterers, in front of anyone close enough to hear the sound land like a verdict of its own. The sound reached the ballroom before the shock did. For one held breath, nobody moved. Not the string quartet, whose bows hung suspended mid-note. Not the waiters, frozen mid-step with trays catching the chandelier light. Not even Marcus himself, whose hand stayed lifted in the air as if he couldn't quite believe it had left his side. Elena's head had turned with the force of the blow, her veil sliding loose from its pins, one gloved hand rising slowly to press against the heat spreading across her cheek. She didn't cry out. She didn't stumble. The pain was real, sharp, immediate. But underneath it, something colder and far more useful was already taking shape. The same clarity she felt reading a verdict before the judge even finished speaking. She lowered her hand and looked at Marcus as though seeing him for the first time without the softening effect of hope. There was no husband left in that face. No partner. No promise of the life they had once spoken about over quiet dinners. Only a man who had just shown, in front of his own father, exactly what he believed a wife was for. Harold didn't step forward to comfort her. He didn't even flinch. He watched the scene with the flat, calculating patience of a man assessing damage to a balance sheet, and that, more than the slap itself, told Elena everything she needed to know about the family she had married into. Marcus tried to speak, his voice already shifting into performance, already rehearsing the version where stress and her own hysteria had provoked him. Elena didn't give him the room. With a calm that made two caterers by the wall instinctively step back, she reached up and slid the ring from her finger. It came free easily, as if it had never truly belonged there. She let it drop, not thrown, not smashed for effect, simply released the way you release something that was never really yours, onto the silver tray a trembling waiter still held at his side. The small metallic clink it made against the glasses somehow rang louder than the slap had. She told him, without raising her voice, that the marriage ended here. She told him the document wasn't going to disappear, and neither would the memory of what his hand had just done in front of 30 witnesses. Harold finally moved, stepping toward her and using her married name, as though those 2 syllables alone could pull her back into the family's grip. Elena turned to him and said simply that she was still a Marsh. The sentence cut through the corridor cleaner than anything shouted could have. Her mother reached her first, pushing past the gathering crowd with tears she refused to let fall, out of pure fright. But Carol's tears, Elena would understand later, weren't weakness. They were the sound of a mother watching her daughter walk through fire and come out still standing. Marcus took one more step forward, hands still low at his sides, his face now blotched with something between panic and rage, looking, for the first time that night, smaller than the names stitched into his tuxedo lining. Elena walked back through the ballroom under the weight of hundreds of eyes. Some held pity, some held shock. Many, she knew from long experience with rooms exactly like this one, were already calculating which side of the story would be safer to stand on by morning. She let them look. Running would have made her the story. Walking made her the verdict. At the entrance, a familiar face broke away from the crowd. Jordan Reyes, sharp-eyed and pale, phone already in her hand though she hadn't taken a single photograph. She had been Elena's closest friend since their first year of law school, before trading litigation for investigative journalism at a newsroom that owed the Whitfield family nothing. She didn't ask what happened. She'd heard enough through the wall. She simply asked, quietly, if Elena wanted to leave. When Elena nodded, Jordan fell into step beside her without another word, offering nothing but her presence, which right then was worth more than any speech. Outside, the night felt absurdly calm. Black cars idled in a row, drivers murmuring to one another, security pretending they hadn't heard the commotion drifting from inside. Elena stood at the top of the steps for a moment, breathing air that felt too cold and too clean after the perfume and candle smoke of the ballroom. The dress that had felt like a promise that morning now felt like a weight sewn from a lie. Jordan opened the car door, but Elena didn't get in right away. She looked back at the lit windows of the hotel and imagined Marcus inside, already rearranging the story, already deciding who would be blamed, already preparing the version where he was the wounded party and she was the unstable bride who ruined her own wedding. Standing there with her cheeks still burning, she understood the real fight hadn't ended in that corridor. It had only just introduced itself. The Whitfield family had lawyers on retainer, friendly headlines waiting to be written, judges who owed them favors, and decades of practice turning their own crimes into other people's misunderstandings. Plenty of people would tell her to let it go quietly, take a settlement, disappear into a smaller life, and be grateful it wasn't worse. But the sting on her face wouldn't let her forget what it had revealed. If Marcus could do this in front of 30 witnesses, chandeliers, and his own father, what exactly was this family capable of when nobody was watching at all? In the car, once the engine started and the hotel lights slid past the window, Jordan finally asked what had been in that paper that started everything. Elena drew the folded document from her clutch and passed it over. Jordan read it under the dim overhead light, her expression darkening line by line. She recognized Corvain Chemical. She recognized the warehouse fire. She remembered a widow who had tried to speak to the press months ago and then vanished from every interview list soon after. Watching her friend's face confirmed the fear Elena had been carrying since the ballroom. This wasn't simply a marriage collapsing. This was a door swinging open onto something far darker, and somewhere behind it, 2 men had died in a fire nobody wanted looked at too closely. As the car pulled further from the hotel, city lights blurring into ribbons against the window, Elena rested her head against the cool glass and let herself feel, for one unguarded moment, the full weight of what had just happened. Then she straightened, because grief could wait its turn behind work, and work was the only thing that had ever truly steadied her hands. She asked Jordan to say nothing publicly yet. A hurried accusation could be swallowed by Whitfield money and turned into noise before it ever became truth. A careful one, built brick by brick, could bring down something that had looked unshakable for decades. When they reached the modest brownstone Elena had kept even during the engagement, despite Marcus's gentle, persistent suggestions that she sell it and move fully into his world, the doorman blinked at the sight of her in a wedding gown near midnight and wisely said nothing. Upstairs, the apartment still smelled like the coffee she'd brewed that morning a lifetime ago. Jordan put the kettle on out of old habit while Elena peeled off gloves that suddenly felt like a costume from someone else's life. In the bathroom mirror, the mark on her cheek had deepened to a dull red, ugly and unmistakable. She touched it once, not out of self-pity, but almost like a lawyer marking an exhibit, memorizing exactly where the evidence lived on her own skin. She changed into plain clothes, and when she returned to the living room, something in her had visibly reset. Jordan recognized the look, the same focus Elena wore during finals week, the same quiet, dangerous calm she carried into closing arguments. On the coffee table, Elena placed the document, her phone, and a black notebook she'd owned since law school, its cover soft with years of use. She wrote 3 names at the top of a blank page: Marcus Whitfield, Harold Whitfield, Corvain Chemical. Beneath them, she began adding dates, wire codes, questions. Jordan watched her friend fold pain into method and understood this wasn't coldness. It was survival with better handwriting. Near 1 in the morning, Elena's phone began buzzing without pause. Guests texting in disbelief. A cousin sending a link to a gossip account already speculating that the bride had suffered a breakdown from wedding stress. A second post claimed the argument had been over a prenuptial dispute about money. Jordan read them aloud and swore under her breath. Elena only noted the timestamps. If lies were moving this fast, the machine was already awake, and a machine awake this quickly was a machine afraid of something. Marcus called 11 times. On the 12th, Elena answered and set the phone on speaker, nodding for Jordan to start recording, as the law allowed for calls involving documented harassment. His voice arrived rehearsed and smooth, insisting the whole evening had been an unfortunate overreaction, that she was embarrassing 2 families over what he called a private disagreement blown out of proportion by her own emotions. He told her, almost gently, that no one would believe her word over the Whitfield name. He told her the document belonged to the company and that keeping it could be considered theft. He told her, finally, that she would regret turning one bad night into a public scandal. Elena let him finish. Then she asked plainly if he was admitting to striking her. The silence that followed was brief, but told her everything. He still believed she could be managed. She said the conversation was over, that anything further needed to go through her attorney, and hung up before he could recover his footing. She saved the recording, sent an encrypted copy to her own private files and another to Jordan, then called a name she hadn't dialed in over a year. Dean Okafor, a forensic accountant she'd worked with on an old securities case, a man who once told her, half joking, that families obsessed with polished marble usually had the most skeletons buried beneath it. He answered groggy, but his voice sharpened the instant she said the words Corvain Chemical. He told her to say nothing further over the phone and to send everything through a secure channel first thing in the morning. By the time dawn crept along the edges of the curtains, the black notebook already held pages of notes, and the folded document sat at the center of the table like a small, patient bomb. The mark on her face throbbed faintly, but it no longer commanded her attention the way it had hours earlier. What commanded her attention now was the certainty that Marcus wouldn't simply vanish from her life because she'd ended the marriage. Men like him didn't disappear. They returned as threats, as lawsuits, as whispered rumors, as favors called in from friends in high places. She wouldn't merely survive what happened to her. She would make sure it could never be dismissed as a private matter behind a hotel corridor door. The knock came just after 10 the next morning. 3 careful taps against the frosted glass of Elena's temporary office, set up in a spare room of her apartment since going back to her old firm felt impossible for the moment. Jordan let the woman in. She looked to be around 45, wearing a thin coat, her hands wrapped tightly around a grocery bag as though it held something more fragile than bread and eggs. She introduced herself as Renata Cole, a former administrative assistant at Corvain Chemical. Before she even sat down, She asked in a voice barely above a whisper if it was true that Elena had walked out on the Whitfield wedding after being struck in front of everyone. When Elena said yes, something in Renata's shoulders loosened, as though that single confirmation had given her permission to finally exhale. Renata had kept copies of internal memos for over a year, terrified she'd one day be blamed for something she hadn't caused. She placed a flash drive on the table, hidden earlier inside a box of crackers, and explained it held emails, falsified purchase orders, photographs of substandard safety equipment, and a message chain where a Corvain manager noted that Harold Whitfield wanted the warehouse expansion finished before any full safety inspection could be scheduled. Elena asked careful questions, not eager ones. Who else had access? What could be independently verified? What risk did Renata herself face by coming forward? She promised nothing would be released before proper legal protection was arranged. Renata, who had clearly expected either a broken woman or a vengeful one, seemed startled to instead find a lawyer who took her fear as seriously as her information. Within days, Dean confirmed what the flash drive suggested. The shell companies from the wedding night document matched 3 of the vendors in Renata's files, all funneling payments toward Corvain Chemical for consulting services no records showed had ever been performed. The warehouse fire that killed 2 workers had begun, according to an internal safety report buried and never submitted, from wiring inspectors had flagged and been overruled on twice. Marcus's name appeared once, in a scheduling note reminding staff that Mr. Whitfield wanted the completion date moved forward regardless of the pending inspection. It wasn't yet an unbroken chain to a courtroom, but it was, as Dean put it grimly over the phone, a very expensive rope for the Whitfield family to keep hiding. That same afternoon, a courier delivered a legal notice to Elena's apartment. Marcus's attorneys accused her of unlawfully retaining confidential corporate property and threatened a defamation suit unless she issued a public retraction and apology within 48 hours. Elena read it twice, then underlined 3 specific phrases in red ink. In demanding the paper's return, they had confirmed its significance. In calling it confidential, they had admitted the contents weren't a simple clerical error. Their own arrogance was building the case against them one sentence at a time. She didn't respond publicly. Instead, she filed a formal reply through her own counsel, stating plainly that she had received the document incidentally at a private event, that she had been physically struck in front of witnesses, and that any further contact from the Whitfield family or their representatives would be treated as part of an established pattern of intimidation. The online campaign against her sharpened in cruelty over the following week. Anonymous accounts recirculated old photographs from her law school years, twisting them into insinuations about impropriety with clients. A society columnist known for dining regularly with Harold Whitfield wrote that certain women confused ambition with love, and that the Whitfield family deserved sympathy for weathering an unstable outburst. Jordan wanted to expose the columnist's ties to Harold immediately, but Elena asked her to wait. Without proof connecting the smear campaign directly to Whitfield money, it would look like 2 women fighting over a broken engagement. With proof, it would look like exactly what it was, a coordinated machine built to bury the truth. That proof arrived 2 days later when a junior employee at a digital marketing firm reached out to Jordan, offering to confirm, in exchange for legal protection, that his agency had been paid by a Whitfield family account to create and operate the very accounts spreading the rumors. That same week, a text intended for someone else landed in Jordan's inbox by mistake, mentioning a reputation package and alignment with Mr. Whitfield Sr. What had felt only days earlier like shapeless fear in the dark now had visible threads, and every thread led back to the same 2 names. Then came the forged contract. Marcus's legal team released a private cohabitation agreement, supposedly signed by Elena weeks before the wedding, in which she agreed to strict confidentiality about all Whitfield family matters and sweeping financial concessions should the marriage ever end. Her signature at the bottom mimicked her handwriting with unsettling precision, but not quite perfectly. Elena studied it calmly, noting the pressure of the pen strokes, the missing small flourish she always left on the final letter of her own name without thinking. It was a forgery, and a rushed one. Within 48 hours, a handwriting expert Dean trusted confirmed digital manipulation in the file itself, mismatched metadata, a signature layered onto a separate background image, no trace of the document ever being transmitted through any channel Elena had used before the wedding. Harold Whitfield had built an empire on the assumption that money moved faster than truth. He hadn't accounted for a woman who documented everything and panicked at nothing. That evening, Elena gathered everyone at her kitchen table, Jordan with her laptop open, Dean with a folder thick with financial trails, Renata quiet, but steady in the chair nearest the window, and her mother Carol pouring coffee no one had asked for because it gave her hands something honest to do. Elena looked around at the small, unlikely alliance that had formed in less than 2 weeks around one folded piece of paper and one open hand raised in anger, and she said calmly that the forged contract was the mistake they'd been waiting for. A man confident in his innocence didn't need to invent evidence. Marcus and his father had just handed her, in their desperation to control the story, the clearest proof yet that the story was exactly what she believed it to be. From that moment forward, it would be the Whitfield family, not Elena Marsh, fighting to survive what came next. The days that followed moved with the strange double rhythm of grief and preparation. Mornings spent organizing evidence into folders labeled with clinical precision, nights spent lying awake replaying the sound of a hand against her cheek until exhaustion finally pulled her under. Elena didn't allow herself the luxury of collapse. She had learned long ago, in courtrooms full of men who expected her to falter, that composure wasn't the absence of pain, but the decision not to let pain choose her next move. Harold's assessor found Dean first, cornering him in a parking garage with an offer dressed up as an opportunity. A generous consulting retainer paid quietly in exchange for reinterpreting certain figures before they reached any formal filing. Dean let him talk, his hand resting on the small recorder in his coat pocket that Elena had asked him to carry since the first threat arrived. When the man finally said the word compensation directly, Dean asked plainly if he was being offered a bribe. The man's face went pale, and he left without finishing his sentence. Jordan, too, was tested. An editor who owed old favors to the Whitfield family called to say a story was already prepared, one hinting that Jordan had coached witnesses and nursed a personal vendetta against a respectable family. Jordan listened without interrupting, then asked evenly whether he'd prefer to receive the proof that a Whitfield-funded agency had built the very smear campaign against Elena before or after his story ran. The line went dead without a goodbye. Then came Harold's visit to Carol's small house on the edge of Colby Creek. Not to Elena's apartment, where cameras and witnesses might record him, but to the mother, where he assumed grief and gratitude might still be persuaded into silence. He arrived with white lilies and a rehearsed voice full of sorrow, asking Carol to help bring her daughter back to reason, insisting decent families settled their pain privately. Carol, who had spent 30 years being underestimated by men exactly like him, opened the door only the width of the chain lock and told him that a house was no place to hide a crime, and that love needed no bought silence to look clean. When he called Elena ungrateful, Carol shut the door before he could finish the sentence. The home security recording reached Elena within the hour, and something in her, watching it, hardened past any last flicker of doubt. The forensic report on the forged contract arrived fully confirmed soon after. Layered signature, incompatible metadata, no trace of transmission on any date claimed. Elena didn't release it immediately. She let it sit, a quiet, undetonated certainty, while Marcus's lawyers pushed harder, assuming her silence meant retreat. It was instead the eye of a storm being carefully aimed. The formal hearing before the Corporate Ethics and Compliance Board was scheduled on a gray Tuesday, and by then reporters had gathered outside long before the doors opened, drawn by rumors the Whitfield legal team could no longer fully contain. Marcus arrived in a dark suit, jaw freshly shaved, wearing the practiced remorse of a man who had rehearsed his expression in a mirror. Harold walked a step behind him, composed and cold, flanked by a team too large for men who claimed innocence. Inside, Elena presented the timeline without theatrics. The folded document, the strike in the corridor, the forged contract, the smear campaign, the bribery attempt caught on tape. Marcus's attorneys tried to separate each incident into its own harmless category, a private dispute, a business matter, an unrelated marketing decision. but Elena showed the dates lined up like stones on a road they couldn't walk around. When Marcus, pressed, blurted out a detail about the very document he claimed never to have known existed, the room felt the floor shift beneath the defense's argument. Harold did not look at his son. That silence traveled through the room like a struck bell. Renata testified next, her voice trembling at first, then steady, describing the buried safety reports and the cost memos prioritizing schedule over inspection. When she finished, no one in the room mentioned marble floors or family name. They only heard, clearly, 2 men who had died preventable deaths. At the recess, Marcus caught Elena near a corridor window, his practiced calm cracking at the edges. He said everything had spiraled out of control, that his father carried business dealings he himself had never fully understood, that the 2 of them could still end this quietly without destroying what remained. He said her name softly, as if the single word could unlock a door he had slammed shut himself. For one unguarded breath, she remembered the man who had once seemed gentle across candlelit dinners, and grief moved through her like a current. Then he said, low and sharp, that if she continued, Renata would be ruined, Dean discredited, Jordan blacklisted, her mother worn down by lawsuits until she broke. Elena felt the old fear tighten in her chest, and beneath it, a colder, steadier resolve. She told him he had just confirmed exactly why he needed to be stopped. Back inside, board members reviewed the recorded threat, the confirmed forgery, the bribery attempt, and the financial trail tying Corvain's falsified safety records directly to decisions made at the highest levels of Whitfield Industrial. The panel's chairwoman set down her pen and looked first at Harold, then at Marcus, and announced that the board was recommending an immediate freeze on Whitfield Industrial's public contracts pending a full criminal referral. Marcus's face drained of color. Harold, for the first time in the entire proceeding, turned his head slowly toward his son, not with sympathy, but with the flat, calculating look of a man deciding exactly where to cut his losses. And Elena, watching that single glance pass between father and son, understood that the empire built on silence had just begun, quietly and irreversibly, to devour itself from the inside. The board's ruling didn't arrive with fireworks. It arrived the way real endings usually do, in dry legal language read aloud by a woman in a gray blazer, and yet the room seemed to tilt on its axis the moment she finished speaking. Reporters outside caught the news before the doors had fully opened, and by evening it moved through every channel that had once carried whispers about Elena's breakdown at her own wedding. The story had finally slipped out of Whitfield hands and into the world on its own terms. Marcus tried, in the weeks that followed, to save what he could. He gave a single interview, stiff and rehearsed, blaming subordinates, blaming pressure, blaming a father who had taught him that obedience mattered more than conscience. Each answer saved a little of himself and condemned someone else, until there was almost nothing left of the man who had once stood so confidently at the center of that ballroom. Harold fared no better. Faced with the financial trail, the falsified safety records, and Renata's testimony, he retreated into the language of governance and delegation, insisting he had trusted his teams completely, until a single message surfaced instructing staff to handle inconvenient reports before they reached outside eyes. There was no dramatic confession. There didn't need to be. Intention had already written itself into his own words. The criminal referral moved slowly, as these things always do, but it moved. Whitfield Industrial's public contracts were suspended pending independent review. 2 of the falsified vendor companies were frozen mid-transaction. Renata received formal whistleblower protection, and months later, a quiet note of thanks from the family of one of the 2 men who had died in the fire, a widow who had once tried and failed to be heard, and who now sat, for the first time, in a room where people actually listened. Elena did not celebrate the way people expect a wronged woman to celebrate. There was no triumphant press conference, no long list of insults finally allowed to be spoken aloud. When a reporter asked her on the courthouse steps if this had all been about revenge for what happened at her wedding, she paused before answering, because the question carried exactly the distortion Marcus had once hoped to plant. She said that revenge wanted pain, but justice wanted limits, that a single act of violence had forced her to see a much larger pattern of harm, one that reached far beyond her own life, and touched people who never had a name in any headline. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The calm in her answer did more damage to what remained of the Whitfield reputation than any accusation could have. In the months that followed, some of her old clients quietly disappeared from her calendar, unnerved by proximity to scandal. She found, to her own mild surprise, that she didn't miss them. Others came specifically because of what she had done, trusting a lawyer who clearly wouldn't trade integrity for comfort. With Dean and a small, careful team, she opened a new practice focused on corporate accountability and protection for whistleblowers, people like Renata, ordinary employees who had simply refused to look away. She named the firm plainly, without embellishment, Marsh and Associates. When her mother saw the freshly painted sign for the first time, she ran her fingers slowly across the letters, the way someone touches a scar that has finally truly healed. On the first morning in the new office, boxes still stacked against the walls, fresh paint still lingering in the air, Elena sat alone at her desk before anyone else arrived. She thought about the wedding dress she had finally donated without ceremony weeks earlier, about the ring left behind on a silver tray, about the low, terrible sound of a hand striking her face in a hallway that had once smelled of white peonies. That memory no longer cut like a blade. It had become something else entirely, not a wound she carried, but a marker of the exact moment she had stopped negotiating her own worth to fit inside someone else's story. Jordan arrived with newspapers under her arm and a grin she couldn't quite suppress. Dean followed with a box of files and dry jokes about finally having somewhere legitimate to store them. Carol came last, carrying a small bouquet of yellow flowers. "Never white again," she said firmly. "Not for a long while." And the three of them filled the quiet new rooms with noise and light, in a way that made the old fear feel, for the first time, like something safely behind glass. That afternoon, a young engineer named Talia Reyes sat nervously across from Elena's desk, hands trembling slightly as she described safety violations she'd reported at her own company and the quiet threats that had followed. Elena recognized the fear immediately, the exact shape of it, and she didn't offer easy comfort or a heroic story. She explained the risks plainly, the protections available, the steps that would need to be taken carefully and in order. By the time Talia left, her shoulders had lowered by an inch, which in that line of work was sometimes the truest measure of hope. As evening settled over the city, Elena turned off the lights in her new office one by one, leaving only the small lamp on her desk burning steady in the dark. Outside, the windows of 100 other buildings blinked on in the dusk, each one, she imagined, hiding its own quiet arguments and quiet courage. She thought of Marcus only briefly now, not with hatred, only with a settled kind of clarity, a man who had mistaken control for love and had lost, in the end, both. She didn't wish him ruin. She wished only that he would never again mistake silence for permission or an apology for a way back in. Before locking the door behind her, she opened the same black notebook that had traveled with her since the night of the wedding and wrote one final line beneath months of names, dates, and evidence. Never again build a life for someone who needs to shrink you to feel whole. She closed the cover gently, without drama, because she had learned by now that real endings rarely make noise. They live instead in the doors a person chooses not to open again, the hands they choose to hold, and the fights they agree to finish without becoming the very thing they set out to stop. Outside, the night air was clean and cold, and for the first time in a long while, Elena Marsh walked into it without looking back once.